Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to bring you the third in our series of programs from a grant that we received from the Association for the Humanities in Idaho entitled Our Responsibility for Nature. Our guest is Katherine Hoffman. Dr. Hoffman is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Idaho, where she has taught since the year 1974. She received her BA degree from Washington State University and her MA and PhD from the University of Washington. She has worked as a research economist for Weyerhaeuser Corporation, the Port of Seattle, and the Washington State Attorney General's Office, and she is listed in Who's Who in American Women. Her topic under this grant is an attempt to resolve ecology and economic realities. As I've indicated to you before, there are public meetings in Coeur d'Alene, Moscow, and Lewiston. She has been very good to come and to deal with this issue on our program. Welcome to our program, Dr. Hoffman. Joining with me in questioning our guests today are regular panelists Mary Lou Reed, a visiting panel member Robert Singletary, and regular panelist Janelle Burke. Welcome, panel.
Thank you.
Lou Reed will start the questioning today.
Katherine, our time will go very quickly, and your subject, economics, is very, very difficult, hard for a lot of us to get our heads around. So I think it would be helpful if we would try to get to the heart of the matter as quickly as we can. In your essay, you refer to economics as the science of allocating scarce resources to competing needs. And I would like to jump to the concept which you propose, which is the concept of common property resources, such as air and water, which remain outside the market system and as such are treated as free and therefore abused. And you quote Aristotle saying that what is common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care. Men pay attention to what is their own. They care less for what is common. Would you then carry on and further describe the problem of the common property resources and perhaps using Garrett Hardin's analogy of the tragedy of the commons and elaborate on these problems related to protecting common resources?
Well, I think that's a very strong point that the common resources are the most difficult because you lack ownership rights, and therefore everyone tends to overutilize them. Garrett Hardin, the ecologist, pointed out that this leads to the tragedy of the commons, and his example was where everyone owns a pasture in common. Since the costs are spread among all and the benefits accrue to the individual, there tends to be a tendency on the part of individuals to increase the herd beyond the point of what we would call efficiency, and it exploits the resource. That occurs because no one has the property right to exclude people from the use of that resource. If we could establish private property rights, then this would not occur. The problem with common resources such as air and water that you mentioned are that it is very difficult to establish property rights. Therefore, we have to resort to some other form of regulation or other device to allocate the scarce resources among, again, the unlimited wants or needs. And I suggest that we try to use a proxy to the market system, pricing, some sort of charge to guide those choices, so people are aware of the cost as well as the benefits. Now they tend to use common resources because there is a lack of a positive price. The cost to them, to an individual, is zero, and therefore they consider these resources free, when indeed to society they are not free. They are scarce. They are limited. So we lack an institutional mechanism in that case.
Perhaps to be more specific, you could suggest some examples where the analogy of the tragedy of commons has already occurred, where we are actually having a squeeze upon the natural resources?
Well, I think, of course, the classic case is in the case of the fisheries, the ocean, because you cannot establish property rights. We have seen the over-exploitation of certain whales and fish, while governments have tried to regulate in this area, and we have international agreements. Nevertheless, there's a tendency to over-exploit. In terms of the United States, in the case of some public resources, such as our government, our parks, and to some extent even in the issue of wilderness, as long as the fee or the charge is zero, people are going to think that it's a free good and tend to overexploit. Now, we may not see that crisis so much at the present time, but in the future, we're going to see more and more stress on those sorts of resources unless we develop a mechanism to allocate and guide choices. And I, again, would say the price system, or some semblance of the price system, is possible, even though you cannot establish private property rights. And I think that's what economics can say. Otherwise, we are doomed to what the tragedy of the commons.
But you don't feel property rights can actually be established in the
Well,
instance of
at
fisheries?
at this point we can't, because the enforcement of that property right is so costly. Now, that does not mean in the future, if technology and so on is available, that is not possible. But at the present time, the property rights, the high transaction cost, and the enforcement rights are so great that you cannot establish property rights.
Robert Singletary.
I'd like to go back to Aristotle's statement and questioning the fact that maybe this statement does not apply totally to modern-day society. Is it possible that our concept of, at one time, maybe man cared more for his own private property or things that are his own in comparison to what is common? I'm wondering if that has not changed itself. I'm thinking of Toffler's book, where he talks about we have moved from a materialistic age which cherished and took care of property, private goods, to one of almost total consumerism, where we use and use it up continually. I wonder if that concept has not gotten so prominent in modern society that this is one of the basic problems dealing with environment.
Well, again, I would resort to the economic principle that the issue of conservation or consumption of any resource is a function of price. And if the price is low, then people are going to consume more. And the ultimate or the optimum rate of conservation or utilization or consumption is a function of price. While this is a bit off of the environmental issue, in energy, for example, at present, we are talking about how hoggish American people are in terms of fossil fuels. It's a function of price. We have artificially held price lower than the actual price in the world market or the availability. And naturally, people are going to buy cars and utilize fuel at a greater rate than if the price were higher. And what have we seen in the last few months? As the price has been rising, we have seen consumption of gasoline and other fuels falling. Now, in the short run, we will not get as great an adjustment as we will in the long run, as people can make adjustments. So back to natural resources, the individual trying to make a choice in terms of their self-interest are guided by prices. And if the price of a commodity or a resource is free, then they assume that they can use it. Where in terms of society, if in fact it is scarce, it should have a positive price to guide choice. And I think, so
right.
The consumption quality that you talk about, I think is a malfunction in our price system, is a result of price controls and not because people are not responding.
It seems that maybe there's a shift in need, where at one time there seemed to be a much more need for the private concern, ownership, private property, to consumerism. That seems to be a major shift, and seems to me to be one of the underlying causes of, maybe even underlies and even predicts and goes beyond the economic concept of pricing, that even price itself, consumption, no matter what price, consumption still takes place.
But what you are suggesting, and which economists will not in general accept, is that the demand is inelastic. And I don't think we can cite any cases throughout history where the demand is inelastic at each and every possible price. So we would say that consumption, or the quantity that people want, is a function of price. And so I don't see any evidence to throw that proposition out.
Janelle Burke.
In your essay, you talk about the difficulty of establishing property rights, which we can all understand, and that it's difficult to decide who owns the air or who owns the water. Although you do say that there are certain rights, primary rights, that is, the first user usually is the one who has the greatest claim to the right. But you say that there are also then two other means of affecting measures against environmental resource depletion, and you say that one is direct government regulation, and then you have a second and very fascinating suggestion as to how it might be regulated. But would you first talk about the difficulties with government regulation and some of the ways that it is costly and from an economic point of view not totally acceptable?
Well, unfortunately, most of our attempts to deal with these problems have been forms of government regulation. And in that, I mean specific requests or requirements that companies do this or individuals do this, that they must have a pollution abatement on their automobile, that a company must put in this kind of scrubber or whatever sort. That's the form of regulation that we are familiar with. That is very costly because it requires a bureaucracy and experts to study these cases, to understand all of the productive processes in various firms. It requires enforcement, which requires the courts, and as you know, in the judicial system, this goes back and forth through the courts, which is very costly in administrative and governmental costs. I suggest that even though you cannot establish property rights, that government, now whether this is the legislature or Congress or an agency like the Environmental Protection Agency, could approximate the social cost of environmental pollution or whatever, whether it's water, air, and then try to price the product, price the effluent, to make that cost, that external cost, an internal cost to the firm or the producer or the decision maker, the consumer, in the case of automobile pollution. The advantage of the latter, the advantage of the price system, is that it relies on incentives, on the incentive to minimize cost and to maximize their satisfaction. Therefore, you will have individual firms trying to find the least cost way of preventing the pollution, rather than having the agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, telling a steel mill or whatever what sort of piece of equipment they must put in. And I think that the pricing mechanism will be more efficient, more efficient in the sense that it will take less resources, and it will be dynamic in that as technology changes, as cost changes, that there will be adjustments made. So I think we can use some of the price system, even though we do not have the ideal conditions of private property to reflect the preferences and such.
You mentioned in your essay that certain businesses or certain products require more pollution in the production of the product. And so you indicate that perhaps in the pricing system then this would be a more expensive product, and that expense would be passed on to the consumer. Perhaps you can explain that to our audience just a little bit more
Yeah.
lucidly than I am doing.
All right. Well, for example, if a firm that was discharging a pollutant into water or air lacked the technical feasibility of preventing that, and there was a charge, a tax in a sense, on that effluent that they had to bear, that will increase the cost of their production, which in turn will increase the price, and in turn, in terms of our demand curve, will cut down on the consumption so that less will be bought and produced of that good, if that were the result. And that may be the case in some situations. So you may be reducing the actual production and consumption of some goods which are now polluting and causing a cost for society.
If any of our viewers have joined our program in progress, our guest today is Katherine Hoffman, an economist and associate professor of economics at the University of Idaho. She is in Coeur d'Alene to discuss an attempt to resolve ecology and economic realities from a grant from the Association for the Humanities in Idaho. We shall continue the questioning with Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Dr. Hoffman, there are lots of people who don't feel that anyone should be given a license to pollute, and you refer to this license to pollute in your essay. How do you counter that?
Well, I think that the question of saying that we should have zero pollution is just unreasonable, given the fact that to prevent, that is to get 100% pure air or water, would just be too costly in terms of the goods and services that we would have to give up. And I give an example in the essay, for example, where economists and others have estimated that as we try to improve the quality of water, let's say the purity of water, the cost of reducing those impurities increases at a greater rate than the reduction in the pollution. This is what we call increasing marginal cost. And those figures, I think, in the essay were from the 1972. For example, to move from 95% to 100% purity, for example, would probably more than double the cost in terms of resources necessary to prevent those impurities. And I don't think society really would be willing to pay those costs at that price.
Well, at this point, we really, I don't believe, have any standards of zero pollution. But in both the Clean and the Air Acts, there are fine systems, which both those acts are regulatory acts, but in addition to requiring the different kinds of scrubbers, et cetera, there also is a system of fines. And as I understand it, there are companies who are willing to pay the fines because that is still cheaper than trying to deal with the technology. How is the public going to react to that kind of situation where they, under your system, would not actually have any control over the pollution?
But I think what people fail to realize, that you can argue about the fine, the level of fines, whether they're significant or insignificant, whether they really are having an incentive effect that is causing firms to search for ways of eliminating or reducing the pollution. And I think in certain cases maybe the fines are not adequate. But besides that, that fine or that cost or that tax not only guides that firm, or should guide that firm, but will also be an indication to other producers, also has an incentive effect for other producers. Now, I'm not sure that in these cases of fines that they are adequate or that they are anywhere near what we would call the marginal cost, and I would agree with you there. But it's the same way I might use another example in the case of antitrust. We have laws and we have the right of the courts to establish fines for people that are found in violation of the Sherman Act or the Clayton Act. Well, some of those fines, while we may say they're large to an average individual, have no deterrent effect because they're so insignificant in terms of the total benefit. So the same principle, I think, applies here. We should try to adjust those fines or those fees to encourage and to promote action on the part of firms.
And to actually almost approximate real costs.
That's right, yes.
Professor Hoffman, in your speech that you're giving, you indicate that the problems of environmental deterioration are not new in our particular time in history, but what is new is the amount of attention that we are giving to environmental issues. And you've alluded to that, I think, already this evening, but very specifically, why is this happening?
Well, I think because as we have progressed, I mean, if we compared our standard of living to our ancestors, our grandfather or our great-grandfather, I mean, they would say we are very affluent. And I think as income increases and we become more affluent, our preferences change. That is, we have satisfied some of the basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, and so on, and therefore we're more concerned about the quality of life. I think you see this in great contrast. If we try to go to an African economy today, Zaire, where they have copper, or their mineral extraction, and we tell these people that they are doing things improperly. For people that have a standard of living, let's say at $300 per capita, they are not as concerned. That is, their preferences are not so much in terms of the beauty and the environmental character as in terms of the basic necessities of food and clothing and survival. And I think our history says the same. So part of this concern is one that we are more affluent. We can afford to be more concerned about how we do things and about the environment.
But as the resources are depleting, we have the energy crisis that we've had, and some of our minerals are apparently going to become more scarce. Will there not be a reverse psychology, and that is, since people want to continue to consume, will they not have less interest in the environment, such as strip mining, so that we have to get what resource we have left, even if it does damage the environment?
Well, I think that, again, the quantity that we consume is a function of price. And I would say the notion of the demand curve, which says that at some price, the quantity consumed or the quantity that people will decrease. And I think that is a function. Now, you may say we have, the private market has not taken into account all those social costs. But that is why we need someone to reflect a common and take care of the common resources. And rather dictating and saying you will do this, I think we have to rely on incentives. Another aspect to your question, as we become more affluent, however, the proportion of output or satisfaction changes to services rather than raw materials and manufacturing. So I think that is another force that is operating after we have sort of solved the basic necessities in terms of raw materials and such for food, shelter, and housing. As we see today, what sector of the economy is growing most rapidly in an advanced economy? It's services. Services of other human beings, experiences and satisfaction derived from those experiences, rather than just an escalating consumption of raw materials. All of this argument about we're going to run out of raw materials, this argument has come up time and time and time again for over 100 years. And invariably we have studies and they say we are running out of this. And if we look back, what do we see? We see they've all been wrong. And I would say even today there's some problems with energy because we have a cartel in the world, OPEC. Which is not to say that oil is not there. The price, if we had a rational price, I'm not sure that we will not find alternatives. Even resources for the future, which has tended in the past to be, I would say, more in terms of the conservation view that we are. Just did a study on fossil fuels and. It concludes that there is no problem if we will again have rational prices for fuel, for energy. And,
Robert Singletary, thank you.
Yes.
Would you comment on your statement that the proper use of environmental resources is more a matter of economy or economics than one of ethics?
Okay. Well, in that statement, I'm saying what is right or wrong, which I think is perhaps a simplification of ethics. My philosopher friends would argue, I'm sure. But I think in a society, that is a function of our preferences and availabilities, and that is what economics tells us. Now, ethics, or our attitudes to what we should or should not do, or what we should or should not want, can certainly affect our preferences. And I did not mention that in terms of dealing with environmental issues, but if you can, information about the consequences of our actions certainly can affect our attitude and our preferences. And I'm sure that part of our attitude today, in contrast to our grandparents or our great-grandparents, is a function that we know more, and therefore our preferences in terms of nature and the environment have been affected. So I don't think they're really a conflict. Ethics or attitude affects preferences, but it's in whether it's going to have an effect, it must be affected via the market.
Janelle Berg.
One of our great concerns as Idahoans is the natural resource we have, which is our national forests. Can you tell us how, in your opinion, would be the best way to manage those national forests?
Well, that's a very very sensitive issue, I'm sure, and I sympathize with the United States Forest Service because I think they have they have all of these various political groups and with strong interest requesting this or that. That is, in a sense, to establish property rights. I wish that in establishing the management criteria for the National Forest, they had paid a little more attention to economics. The new Forest Management Act, which was passed in 1976, gives some alludes to some economic criteria. But prior to that, there was always this question of sustained yield, which is a physical criteria and has nothing to do with economics. And I think that has led to problems. Actually, we could, if the national forests were managed with economic criteria, that is, recognizing the social benefits as well as the private benefits, we could have more of both. We could have more forests, more timber products, and more wilderness and recreation.
How's this going to happen?
I don't know. That's a political question. I am a little discouraged because I think it is such a difficult thing to try and explain that it's unlikely that they will change that issue. But as time goes on, the preferences and the demands upon that resource are going to be greater and greater, and in time they're going to have to use more and more economic criteria.
I must interrupt. We're out of time. I want to express our appreciation. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Professor Katherine Hoffman from the University of Idaho, discussing an attempt to resolve ecology and economic realities. In a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, we shall be bringing program number 4 in this series, and it will be by Gary Williams, dealing with sexual metaphors for the American landscape. He is in the field of literature at the University of Idaho. Next week, we'll deal with a different subject, and I hope you'll be with us at that time. Until then, have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.